The hallmark of a great conversation for me is where you discover or uncover things that weren't there at the beginning through combination or recombination, like Arthur's talking about, through different lines of sight, different angles, different associations. And so it's much, much more when it's functioning well than a predictable communication machine. It's not about getting to these things that you can already see in advance. There's a role and a time and a place for that, but that to me is a much lesser thing than this kind of joyful, unruly beast that yields all sorts of things. As soon as you go into it with a precise or contained idea of what you want, then you can only at best achieve what you've already imagined. Whereas the joy of a good conversation is you blunder across or things unfold in front of you that you couldn't really imagine. So it's not efficient in that sense, but it can be incredibly effective. And it's having all these effects at lots of different layers: the social, the energetic, the connective, the imaginative, the linguistic, all sorts of things are going on all at once.
Welcome to episode 16 of Humans on the Loop. I'm your host, Michael Garfield, and today I'm furthering our exploration of wisdom in the age of magical technologies in dialogue with my friend and inspiration, Robert Poynton, founder of Yellow Learning, associate fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford, and author of 3 beautiful books, Do Pause, Do Improvise, and Do Conversation. His writing conveys insights from decades of designing and leading executive education leadership programs, teaching in the Oxford Strategic Leadership Program, and hosting creative retreats in Spain. I regard Robert as a model for the kind of life way I consider crucial in our moment of chaos and complexity. And in Future Fossils episode 196, linked in the show notes, he and I discussed how important it is to learn the principles of improvisation as a way of life. As he notes in his latest book, most of us are already skilled improvisers because we spend our lives in conversation, not just with each other, but with our environments. How does trying on this frame transform the ways that we relate to them? Those of you who know me know how much I like to play with metaphor and see it as a core skill. So I jumped at the chance to talk with Robert about conversations as a technology, and technology as a conversation, in an historical moment when so many of us are having what feels like literal conversations with technology. How do we create fertile conversational fields? How can we be generous with our improv partners? How do we learn from the structure of conversations in space and time to delimit our engagement with AI and allow us to converse meaningfully with the entire history of a person or a culture? At the heart of this project and this episode is the belief that some things are worth doing not because they get us somewhere in particular, but because they're pleasures in themselves. Good conversations are their own reward, not just because they get us where we want to go, but because they bring us together in surprising ways. So just maybe stretching this analogy to cover all the ways we relate to one another and our built environment will help us bring more wisdom and imagination to the stuff our lives are made of. If you like this jam as much as we did, please comment and subscribe, and then feel free, as Robert said about it, to go lie down in a darkened room afterwards. And if you want more, I've got great news. Starting May 13th, I'm teaching a 5-week course on how to live in the future at Weirdosphere, the online platform hosted by my friends Phil Ford and JF Martell of Weird Studies. Drawing on over 20 years of research, this course is a guided off-road romp through the bizarre and wonderful moires of biology, philosophy, and mysticism to help you make new sense of our century's metamorphoses and artful ways to participate in the strange new worlds to come. Members get 10% off, and partial scholarships are available for those in need. I imagine there are a lot of you. Learn more and enroll at weirdosphere.org or grab your discounted membership registration link at michaelgarfield.substack.com/weirdosphere. To get a taste of what that course will be like, join the members-only book club call for Federico Campagna's book Prophetic Culture on Saturday, May 3rd, and or Join me and Turquoise Sound for the free public session on Right Relationship with AI, hosted by the School of Wise Innovation this Thursday, April 24th. Links for both of those in the show notes as well. Lastly, I want to thank everyone for supporting this work, which is my all-in bet that this kind of wayfinding only becomes more valuable as the going gets weirder. This is the best way I know how to create a public record of my learning and to foster relationships between people and ideas at a time when nothing else feels more important. I actively dislike playing the solopreneur content creator finite game, but despite appearances, Humans on the Loop is starting to ripen into an infinite game as amazing collaborations take shape in the space around it, and the insights generated here are spilling over into many other scenes. Your patronage gives me and all of that the time we need to incubate. So my enduring gratitude goes out to all of you for recognizing that any future worth trading on the market has to start as culture. Big ups to Mike Kripe, Brent Powell, and all members past, present, and future. This week, my thanks take the form of an appendix to this episode, 11 extra minutes that would have felt bolted onto our dialogue had I left them in, but were too good to leave on the cutting room floor. That's in the show notes for you all. And that is all for now. Thank you and enjoy. How are you?
Yeah, good. It's a miserable time of year where I live here in Spain because we get most of our rainfall in this period. So it rains the whole time. And yet you have to remember that's a good thing. Yeah. I had to learn, when I first came here, I was like, but I'm English. How can this rain be pissing me off? And then you go, yeah, but like in England, it never rains all night and all day, 3 days in a row. It just doesn't do that. So actually, the key characteristic of British weather is its undependability, not its raininess.
I was just out for a rare moment on the road. I prize these moments. I was up in New York for Climate Week, which of course is this huge oxymoron. It's like everyone flies in from everywhere. I have to admit it was for somewhat selfish reasons of like going to find work. You go fishing where the fish are. But
Yeah.
at any rate, I was up there and it was the week that the hurricane hit Asheville, North Carolina. Horrible, but in New York, it was this lovely rainy weather that we never get in Santa Fe, where it rains all day, like what you're talking about.
Right.
And I missed it. I was just like, oh God, like this was like growing up in Florida and it just being wet, and just being like, oh. And then of course you can't enjoy anything anymore in this world without it being like, well, you were just in the Goldilocks zone of what was tragic for someone else.
Yeah. Right.
So,
Yeah, that's true.
so yeah, anyway, shall we?
Yeah, let's do this.
Okay. Robert Poynton, you're on the loop.
Thank you.
So yeah, now I've had the pleasure of talking with you on 2 different shows. The cool thing, not the cool thing, this is about 2 different books, and this book makes this conversation awkwardly recursive throughout. We're gonna have, I'm the way I'm gonna treat this is rather than getting too studious, there are opportunities to just bibliomancy open to various highlights rather than sit there and like consult the tabs. Because I trust that you really are the person that I hold in highest esteem as someone with whom I can guarantee an interesting and relevant conversation without referencing source material, but because I am trying to be a little bit more diligent about this particular show and, to keep it on task, as it were.
Sure.
then where I want to take this with you is you do talk about conversations and technology in this book, and then conversation as technology, and then the relationship between conversation and improvisation. And really, all three of those are where I want to direct people's attention in getting better at relating to technology in a natural and conversational way.
Can I
But
just,
first, yeah,
well, I just immediately have a response to that. As I was
please.
writing, I was doing a lot of reading as I was writing, as you might imagine. And I was really struck by the temptation that people have to reach a firm conclusion about the relationship between technology and conversation. And people reach very different conclusions, but they're very quick to reach those conclusions, it seems to me, or perhaps not so quick, but once they do, they're fairly firm about them. And I remember as I was writing, thinking, what do I think? And I spent a lot of time thinking, I don't really know. And then my conclusion, such as I reached it, is that this is complicated and changing, and that I'd never thought of it in the way that you just put it, though it's a very apt description, that there's both, conversation and technology and conversation as technology, and that kind of both of those exist. And it just seemed facile to me to fall in any particular fixed position and to say whatever happens on a device can't possibly be conversation because it's lacking the bandwidth of full human connection. But by the same token, it seems absurd to pretend it's the same. So then where I ended up was just going, these are interestingly different. And what can it tell us about how we're relating to each other and communicating? And also just to be cognizant of the fact that over time, as different technologies have developed, writing being perhaps the most obvious of them, commentators in the past have reached similarly firm and perhaps premature conclusions about the impact of this technology. And any technology will have probably more unforeseen consequences than predictable ones. And that our imagination, our creativity, and our ability to play with things is a lot of what yields those unexpected and often fortuitous and positive outcomes. So in a very literal sense, watching my kids invent ways to use WhatsApp that I never would have dreamt of, So I just think it's a much more interesting question that I'm reluctant to reach a firm position on than perhaps I realized at the outset.
I want to take this into some truly weird places with you because I know that you're epistemically open in that regard, as you just said. What I want to do first, at risk of killing the vibe, is I'm trying to anchor for people in every episode who it is they're talking to.
Right.
This is sort of like a simulation of actually knowing people, right?
Right.
So why are you this way? Where do you come from? I don't think we even really talked about this when I had you on Future Fossils. Like, what is your origin story? What are the catalytic events that led you to care about the orchestration of space and time and props and discussion partners and all of these clever ways that teach people how to kind of garden conversations? Where did that attentiveness emerge in your life? And like, why is it that you've got these three books, Do Pause, Do Improvise, Do Conversation? They're all coming from a single stem. Like, what is that stem?
Yeah, that's the question I found myself holding when I finished this one. And I'm still interested in it, still exploring it. I think, what is that stem? What unites them? What's the wellspring which these guys come from? Because I do think those three books are all different paths through very similar material. I think, I'm old enough, perhaps it was more common in the days when I was a child, where kind of we were the family that had conversation over dinner and played word games and spoke. And my parents delighted in conversation. So I think my home as a child was a sort of crucible of conversation. So I think that the early seeds are there. I think, I studied at Oxford University, and I think at the time I was unaware of the influence of this, but the education there happens intermingled with the living, So again, in those days, you would leave home to go and study at university or at college. And the college, in an Oxford context, that word means something specific, which is the college is your home. It is the place you live. So it combines both halls of residence and libraries and gardens and all those kinds of things. And so formal teaching, such as it is, because in those days it was pretty minimal, happens much more through a conversational method, the tutorial, where you're expected to have read something, assimilated it into a form that you can read out. So an essay is not delivered, it was written and then read. And then it's essentially debated with yourself and a tutor and one or two other students. And your ideas are scrutinized and examined. And the essay really is not a thing which gets graded or marked in its own right. It's a provocation for a conversation where your ideas are challenged, questioned, and you're responding to those responses. So that's the sort of formal part of it. But the teaching that I enjoyed, if indeed that is the right verb, was perhaps not of the highest quality. And the informal web of conversation that happened, as young people will, staying up all night, putting the will to rights, debating, both with the peers that you are studying the same subject with, but importantly, in an Oxford college where people are there studying every subject, you might be hanging out with people who study completely different things to you: chemistry, law, languages, history, political science, whatever. And so that kind of crucible of conversational testing, and I think, Oxford does have a lot to do with this, because another part of that is the kind of dinners and dining and conversation over a table. And so there's a kind of a rich weave of that. I think at the time I was largely unconscious of it. And I think another strand of my development here would have been, I spent a few years working in advertising, where you've got people of very different persuasions and disciplines working together in the same company. So those essentially responsible and interested in the business, others focused on consumer and market data, and copywriters and art directors really only interested in kind of the creative part of it. And so I think in that context, I learned that you need to set the room and set your stall out differently to have a different kind of conversation with each of those constituencies. And actually, when you have to have them talk together, you need to think even more deeply about how to bridge across those, if you like, cultural divides. So I think it was there all along. And then as my work developed into the realm of teaching and learning, I think I then got very sensitized to how boring most teaching and learning is, and that the idea of transmitting information through some sort of lecture format is so ineffective and hopeless. And then you go, okay, conversational model of learning, not that I was thinking in these terms at that time, but the role of play and playfulness, and then the role of setting. I remember really well when, I was been using improvisational theatre in this context of executive education for quite some time, when somebody who had chosen to study me came and said, so how do you prepare in the room before the session starts? And they asked questions which at the time I hadn't really thought about. And I remember saying to her, what do you mean? She said, for example, where would you stand? And I went, oh, I don't know. And then I realized I did know. And I'd said, oh, well, I drew the room. And because I wouldn't stand too close to the door because that would be too confrontational, but I wouldn't stand too far away because, I wouldn't have my back to them. And I literally mapped out the room that I'd just done a session in and drew a space and then lines of sight and all that stuff. So I think what's happened over time for me is the things that were just emerging in my practice and in my work, I've then started to pay attention to and articulate and realize that you can make more conscious, deliberate choices about those, even in the simplest of occasions. So, a one-on-one conversation, do you sit opposite them? Do you sit next to them? That's a basic and fundamentally different choice, which will yield a different set of outcomes. It's not that one's good and one's bad, but you just get highly attuned to all of this. And then it just seems it's just everywhere. It's completely obvious. So I think, that's a version of how I came to be where I am.
I resonate with the question of line of sight. Where you have improv theater, I have improv music, and working with people together on stage. And I remember at one point last year, I was running this monthly where we had 11 people on a really rather small stage. And the question of how you fit all of these people together in a way, like how do you organize them in space? Because it's not like theater, but it's maybe more like a classroom environment where you are where you are. And so, the question of having to attend to each other, and then the issue of being visible to the environment and to the audience. And I started noticing that there were conversational subclusters in the band. It's like these people can hear each other and see each other really well, and everyone else can't. And you have to treat them as a unit. I think about that in relationship to these broader issues of and the way that we're partitioned from one another in our experience. But rather than ramble, I wanted to pick up on something that you said in, was it page 28? You quote historian Theodore Zeldin that conversation doesn't just shuffle the pack, it creates new cards, which reminds me of Brian Arthur's book, The Nature of Technology. And this is that conversation as technology thing.
Right.
Brian says that every new technology spans the space of recombinant interaction, and every technology is a combination of existing technologies. And then on the page before that, you say, if conversation is not about solving problems, transmitting a message, or getting a result you want, then another possibility is that it is simply a pleasure in itself. This is a huge thing in this series about how to intentionally navigate like a figure ground reversal and move back and forth between instrumental and intrinsic reward. Like how to understand philosophy as essential to civilization because we need new ideas. We need what conversation generates in order to respond to the surprises that conversation generates. To the extent that we want to fold it into a broader category of technology, that is also true. But like the thing that I would love to hear you speak to that I think is really hilarious is when people talk about generative AI, and you have a section in here about interacting with ChatGPT. The business world seems to want to bend it to the goal of enhancing productivity. Like Ethan Mollick at Wharton has written, has basically created this brand around helping people to understand how co-intelligence with AI improves your ability to perform in the workplace. But I watch his LinkedIn feed and it's mostly him just like fucking around. It's like he's mostly just enjoying playing with new technological toys and then reporting on it. And there's, Kenrick Alado McDowell, whom I interviewed for this series, makes an argument that basically output is hallucinatory because what you're talking about is embeddings, like cutting paths through this high dimensional semantic space, and that there's something that like resists being productized, or like the people who are getting the most out of it are the people who are willing to play with it. And so like it's funny because we've made this simulacrum of human verbal intelligence that operates in a similar kind of linguistic space, drawing correlations between things. And then you see people making the same mistake with it that I arguably am making right now, which is to try and like bend this messy, playful thing into the service of some known goal. And I would just love to hear you riff on that at length.
I think that last phrase you used is where I kind of start. So it's paradoxical. So there is paradox here. There's contradictory things in some kind of creative tension. But it's the idea of the known goal that I think is both distortion. That's what introduces the distortion, and actually, which also introduces the possibility, if not the likelihood, of disappointment. Because as soon as you articulate a known goal, and I should qualify this by saying, I'm happy with a broad intention. I see that as different from a known goal. When you've already decided what you want to get from something, I'm assuming that you're being relatively specific. And I think that it's like aiming off. You get to all sorts of fabulous outcomes by not knowing that they even exist. And you do that by following the energy, which is a lived phenomenological thing, a kind of a human interest, energy, curiosity, zest, spark. And that could come from aesthetics. It could go, oh, that's a great turn of phrase, or isn't that squishy? The word somebody chooses or an image that they call to mind might divert a conversation in a certain path and then yield something of value or usefulness that you hadn't meant to explore. And actually, fun enough, you just look sideways, this is a bit of a separate point. The history of scientific discovery is full of these serendipitous happenings where people discover or notice things that they hadn't set out to discover or weren't even working on. And sometimes there's lags as well involved. So it's familiar even in that kind of more rigorous world of science. But in conversation is like, by committing and energetically engaging to the joy of the thing itself, if you like. And I think that word joy is important because there's a human exchange, there's a delight, there's an unexpectedness, and not knowing what the other person will see or do, seeing what you've said or do with what you've said or how they'll respond. And all of that uncertainty here is a positive in my view, or certainly can be made into one. And then when you follow that energy and fall into that way of being together, it's nobody's sole possession. That the hallmark of a great conversation for me is where you discover or uncover things that weren't there at the beginning through combination or recombination, like Arthur's talking about, through different lines of sight, different angles, different associations. And so it's much, much more when it's functioning well than a predictable communication machine. It's not about getting to these things that you can already see in advance. There's a role and a time and a place for that. But that to me is a much lesser thing than this kind of joyful, unruly beast that yields all sorts of things, And it doesn't necessarily even have to be social. So I spent yesterday reading the manuscript of a yet to be published book. The author had sent it to me. I know her, it's true. But I felt like I was having a conversation with her as I was reading. And my task for the day was to read the manuscript so that I could offer a comment or a critique. And along the way, things kept blurting out. Oh, that reminds me of this. And, oh, God, I'll look at that artist she's referenced there. And so things were coming out of it because I was, as it were, engaged even in a solitary conversation with her body of text. So I think, looping it back to what you said, I think, as soon as you go into it with a precise or contained idea of what you want, then you can only at best achieve what you've already imagined. Whereas the joy of a good conversation is you blunder across or things unfold in front of you that you couldn't really imagine. So it's not efficient in that sense, but it can be incredibly effective. And it's having all these effects at lots of different layers. Like I say, the social, the energetic, the connective, the imaginative, the linguistic, all sorts of things are going on all at once.
This inspires in me a reflection on the sort of introversion and extroversion in conversation, because you talk about early in this book, let's make the most of this technical issue here. I really like that you were talking about on social media that the rough magic of entanglement in live conversation is lost when everything becomes too polished. And yeah, there's something about, technology is that which you only notice when it stops working.
Yeah.
In the way that, like, I was like listening to, or rather, I was listening to your voice reading this book. I was reading you talk about all of these different structural ways that you can kind of design conversation space to encourage different conversational outcomes. And, for instance, facing each other versus sitting side by side. And I was thinking about all the awkward conversations that young me and young my wife had in cars, in a parked car, like at the end of some encounter, she's about to leave and we're stuck in a vortex, and it's like, we're not really looking at each other. We're both staring out into space. And there is something about the internet here. I've been thinking a lot about this dissociation and bandwidth and the way that when people interact on social media, it's, like you're interacting with the highly pixelated version of someone. And just like moments ago before you switched the network, I was in fact interacting with the highly pixelated version of you,
Right.
and like drifting off into, God only knows what, introspection, projection. There's this conflict. I wouldn't call it a paradox because I think it's much more just like a stock oxymoron, that when we try to reach out to touch each other, AT&T, in the process, what technology is doing, removing us from the context of each other.
Yeah.
And like, I love the fact that I wouldn't even know you if not for Chris
Well,
Kutarna introducing us and Mike Large over COVID. But like COVID was one of those times when we were like working out as a society what it meant to try and collaborate in any kind of meaningful, consistent way on video calls. And yeah, this is something I'd like to hear you speak to because it seems like it has, again, like I want to draw back and anchor it in something far more general, which is the way that quantitative systems broadly make one thing fungible for something else. You know, like you've got 5 oranges and 5 apples now. And in spite of the fact that they're completely singular entities, that they can be operated on economically or scientifically. And that logic carries us into a place where, you know, each of us is constantly in conversation in some way or another. And also, I'm alone in a box all day,
yeah.
literally.
Yeah. I think, I've had lots of different thoughts about this. When the pandemic began, the work I was mostly doing before the pandemic was live workshops using improv theater stuff. And so, I've been working virtually since 1994 when I lived in Argentina and worked for a company that was based in Scotland. So I'm no stranger to the working remotely stuff. But for the particular work I was doing, the technology seemed so unpromising, I looked the other way and stayed in denial for a long time. And then needs must, and what was really interesting was when we started Yellow, which was the kind of online space that I began to cultivate, we did a number of things, which was we chose to work with very small groups, so groups of 6. And we chose to meet repeatedly every 2 weeks, 2 hours every 2 weeks for 6 months. So we were weaving some fabric in and amongst a small group of people. And then doing that, what I discovered was that many of my prejudices were flawed or wrong. And actually all sorts of things turned out to be possible that I hadn't imagined. But at the same time, it's still so, you can eat things and watch pieces of film and all that kind of stuff. But you do breath work, you can do all sorts of things online that I hadn't thought were possible. But over time, the fatigue kicked in and there's still that separation you talk about. And I think that is an important marker. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not one of those people that say, no, proper conversation can only happen in person physically. But at the same time, the lack of the shared context, in a text conversation via a device, what's happening between those moments in movies we see with the 3 dots, where the person's waiting for the reply, that's a very different thing than when you're sitting in a room with somebody and they're thinking about what to say next. And so, I think that is a kind of big shift. And I don't think they are fungible. I don't think you can reduce the one to the other. What I think is important to do is to accept, again, I think this is in Brian Arthur's work, this idea that technology redefines old technologies as well. So new technologies reframe what old technologies, the space they occupy, the opportunities they afford people. And so this whole new realm that we're still in our infancy with exploring, I think, afforded us a whole set of new opportunities. My skepticism, which was exaggerated, probably then led to an exaggerated enthusiasm. And then I'm kind of reaching perhaps a more mature view. But just to use a concrete example from last week, there's a call which now happens virtually amongst the associate fellows of the business school at Oxford, where I'm one of their number. And I couldn't make the call, so I chose to listen to the recording. And I realized, there's great virtue in listening to the recording because I can skip to the bit I'm interested in. It's 50 or 60 people on the call. So there's actually very little virtue in me being there live, And so that's a tiny refinement, a technicality almost around an existing technology that I just realized last week, And I mean to say we'll constantly keep refining, and each of us will do so in different ways, our understanding of kind of the roles they play. But I think the important thing is to recognize and realize that they are not reducible the one to the other. I think that's the key thing for me. And they're better at different things. So you and I would not have a relationship were it not for the technology. And that is fabulously enriching for me. But at the same time, were we to be able to be in a space together with a whole bunch of other people making music and having conversation and eating food, that would clearly be of a different nature. And I just think, that will always be true. The refinements and how we use them will shift and change. But Yeah, they're different.
So this is where I want to get weird with you
Great.
because there's that, oh my God, who is it? There was that Freudian slip in some fantastically funny, oh my God, I have to look this up. Hold on just a second. Ah, yes, The Big Lebowski.
Like,
Okay. There's this slip where he says he treats objects like women. And okay, so there's the question on the one hand of like, what you're speaking to is could this meeting have been an email?
yeah,
Right? Like,
right.
and that's the enormous convenience of all of these economies of scale and the ability to choose the orbital at which you're interacting with something, like if it turns out that you actually do better working remotely, good, let's
Mm.
put you there. If it turns out that you get as much as you need to from the recording, that's interesting because like later on in this book, you talk about again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Plato's famous objections to writing, the fact that writing, like you were saying about the process at Oxford, where it's not just the presentation of an essay, but the argument of an essay. And that, Plato contested that writing doesn't argue back.
Yeah,
But in an important way, chatbots do argue back, or they can simulate argument in some kind of interesting way. My buddy Tom Morgan actually just got retweeted by Sam Altman at OpenAI for opening a protocol to ask ChatGPT to tell you things about yourself that you don't know. So my friends have been doing various versions of this, like asking it to roast you, or, like I asked it because of my buddy Arathime, Bobby West, who's an astronomer who also makes excellent electronic music. Somebody hit him up on Instagram saying, ChatGPT told us to collaborate. And he was laughing because he's like, why should I listen to the authority of, but at the same time, people are speed dating one another in simulation with OkCupid. They're like running your digital twin now
mm,
and then simulating compatibility and then introducing you to the people where the first date in Second Life went well or whatever. Right. And so, yeah, there's this weird thing about, in a way, you can use language models to freeze, to take a picture, or you can use them to remain mutable and responsive like a mirror, or you can engage with them adversarially the way that people used to be worried that your double in the mirror would like kill you and replace you.
right.
And like, there's all these different kinds of handles on it. Where I'm going with this is I think one of the things I see a lot of people reckoning with right now is the more lifelike technology becomes, the more it makes us strange to ourselves, or the more we recognize the ways in which, like Krishnamurti and Gurdjieff would, talk about, like the question is not, one of conscious machines, it's one of conscious people. Like your default is you're a robot, you're just acting on your training data,
Yeah,
and that,
yeah.
that people struggle with institutions because you are an institution and,
Oh, that's
you're,
cool. It's funny actually you
yeah.
should mention those two because at the weekend I was at a session of some Gurdjieff music where one of the readings quoted Krishnamurti saying, and I thought this is so typical of Krishnamurti saying, I've been singing a song my whole life to deaf people, in that fabulously patronizing way he had of saying everybody's asleep, and they're all conditioned. But where my mind was going as I was listening to you, I was like, oh, that's cool. Because maybe then if we look the other way, maybe what we'd say is, that I haven't quite got the language for this, but bear with me. It's almost like we only come into our full aliveness at certain particular moments of the day. A lot of the time we're like, you could have a kind of scale of asleepness or wakefulness or whatever. And if you did that, then the whole idea of the kernel of true or authentic self, as it's called in the literature, that doesn't make any sense to me, then that would completely disappear because you go, well, like waves, right? So, and some of the time I'm like full on and really alive and really alert and fascinated and sparky and both giving and receiving. And sometimes I'm, somnolent. I might look very animated. I might be talking a lot, but actually it's all dead talk, dead air, and you can have a little glowing light, that's flashing according to my degree of aliveness. And then you get a whole different take on a human self versus a technological self. And you get these lines and waves. And it's interesting because in yellow, in yellow is now taking on a new form, which is to do with physical dimensions, physical gatherings, mostly, but not just. So physical objects and physical gathering. And the question for yellow, both in its online form and now in its new form, has always been what brings you alive. That kind of cropped up in the first session, keeps coming back in different ways, in different forms. And so in the context of this conversation, this would be tantamount to saying my aliveness, I'm not going to take for granted. It comes and it goes, it ebbs and it flows. Sometimes I feel really alive, and sometimes I feel a shadow of myself, or a kind of deathly or ghostly or mechanical. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Kind of reminds me of almost as if like when you talk about, actors can give lively performances or deathly ones. And Peter Brook, wrote about deathly theater and how even a lavish production could be deathly. So yeah, so maybe there'll come a point where aliveness is not binary. You're not alive or dead. You're alive to a certain degree, and technology starts to blur that sharp line. Yeah.
So on the recommendation of J.F. Martel, I'm about to dive into the work of Federico Campagna. I don't know if you know his stuff, but he writes about technic and magic. And I think if at a distance, it seems like what he's talking about is similar to the way that Ian McGilchrist recognizes the attentional modes of the left and right hemisphere, as, the left being kind of goal oriented and efficient and driven by instrumental concerns, and the right being seeing a world suffused by life and meaning. And so that's where I wanted to take this with you. Like, I can find myself hitting the same beats in conversation because it's something in my brain has decided that this works. And, or like a stage performance can be really, really concerned. Like, that's like Hollywood now, right? Like all of the attention is being paid to the drapes and the costumes and the technical aspects of the production.
Yeah.
And it's harder, although I think this fleeting transient state, the question of an attention paid to magic in filmmaking has taken the back seat. And I bring this up just because, like, going back to that trinity of conversation and technology, conversation as technology, and conversation of technology, there's also technology as conversation. And from like an information theoretical view, if we strange ourselves and see ourselves as cybernetic computational systems, then in my experience and many other people I talk to, it kicks in animism, and suddenly the whole world seems like it's talking because, you're looking at that very sort of general level of information exchange, and a very general definition of information requires some sort of sense making of data. And so then you get into this thing of like, okay, well, like the principles of conversation that you provisionally outline in this book, how can we apply them in novel, interesting ways to our interaction with the non-human, with technology itself? Like, how can we be in better conversation, not just with other people, but with...
Well, I mean, that's interesting. Yeah, God knows. But an immediate response for me is, in my limited, very limited experience of ChatGPT, my attitude to what I ask it and how I ask it, the kinds of things I ask it for, has changed. And it's changed from, I think I held an unconscious model when I was, ChatGPT appeared on the scene while I was writing this book, which was interesting and challenging. And so initially I was checking information, using it for research, fact checking prior to it going to copy edit, those kinds of things. Until I remember asking it, I was just want to check when David Bohm published the booklet on dialogue, which he actually wrote with Krishnamurti. And ChatGPT told me that, I don't know, 1996 or something. And I sat there thinking, how the hell did I read it in 1990 then? So, I pretty quickly discovered, as everybody does, that it's not about that. And now, so if I just truncate all of that, whereas before I was wielding a mental model that said, this is some kind of machine that is rendering kind of observable, objective bits of data to me. Now I ask it for opinions. and I take them as opinions. So in my mind, I'm already framing it as a conversational partner where it's an interesting question to ask. And like I said, I'm using it in an incredibly rudimentary way, but I'm holding how I think of what I ask it and how it responds to me much more in the way that I would ask, somebody who might know something about what I'm interested in, but no more. So at a very basic level, the attitude that we hold to it would change that. And I think, ironically enough, I know there's risk in the anthropomorphizing, but if we brought the caveats that we bring to bear when we talk to other people to talking to technology, maybe that would give us some clues about, do we want to sit opposite ChatGPT or next to it? What would that mean? What would that look like? Do we want to have, this conversation that we're having with this information flowing around? Is it a conversation to make a decision? Is it a conversation to get to know each other better? What's this conversation about? So the framing that you put around any kind of information exchange. So I think it'd be quite an interesting exercise to take those ideas and map them onto the sort of conversations you're talking about, or conversation as a conceit, in that case, and just see where it took you. And my hunch is that all of it would be about holding everything a lot more lightly, being much more aware of contingency and provisionality, and everything being woven rather than welded. That would be my guess.
I like woven rather than welded. It just appeals to my fondness for alliteration. But, okay, so there is something about that and about the way that these ideas are anchored, or the way that they originate in the body, and the body in the broader sense of the body as, co-defined, co-arising with the environment. You make the point very clear in this book, as you have in this conversation, that conversation is about the body. My old late friend, Dr. Blue, Norman Katz, who I interviewed on Future Fossils 124, and is a big part of why I moved to New Mexico, because he has this enormous center of gravity. He brought all these people into constellation around him. And he used to tell me that hypnosis and psychotherapy are actually more about the body than the mind, which is why they have you lie down on a couch.
Right.
It's just like the whole point of being supine and reflective and vulnerable, that you can't have those kinds of conversations if you're standing on your tiptoes. And so I'm thinking about that again with respect to technology. And like one of the first books that got me really thinking about the transcendent was Cyber Grace by Jennifer Cobb, which in strange ways seems rather dated now. It's from 2000. And in other ways has remained completely evergreen. And one of the points that she makes in that book is that the internet then, and arguably also now, like there's certain things you never change about interacting with ChatGPT, and things that I'm obsessed with changing. Like you say on page 77, if you book the same old meeting room, you are likely to have the same old conversation. If that's what you want, fine. But if you want something new or different, then it's a problem. It's even worse online, where the experience is so much thinner than in person. You can have great conversations online, to your point earlier, but creating the conditions for that requires extra care and attention, not less. And so, I'm thinking about the obvious influence of the movie Her on what we are collectively doing with chatbots, the way that they're developing. The one thing that is the huge gap that I see there is not so much in the potency of the software itself, as much as in the interface and the fact that all of us remain hunched over desks or over our phones, that the screen is so fundamental to the experience of interacting with AI. Samantha in Her is experiencing the world vicariously through him, and they're commenting on the same stuff, even if she has a more limited sensory portal to that life, his Umwelt, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about this in terms of one of the things that I want to do as like a technological experiment with this show is to bundle it all together into a chatbot. And this is like completely beyond my technical expertise, but hopefully someone listening to this is like, oh my God, that's cool. Let's do it.
Yeah.
To get it all together into a chatbot that I can run in smart glasses, and like give that chatbot my camera view and to have it comment on the world that I'm seeing and see if the collective intelligence of all the people I'm talking to at this show can like stand in the world with me.
But then what you're a bit missing, because if you go to Samantha, the chatbot in the glasses, it's getting your worldview, but what it's missing is its own body, right? Because where I was going with, as you were speaking, was like, oh, right. So what we need to do is embody these AIs, not so that they can move around and go to the office in a sort of practical, prosaic sense, but so that they can hunch over screens. They can lounge, because like you say, the therapist, they don't lie you down. It's not coincidence that everything I'm hearing from you, I'm filtering through my own kind of sensory apparatus, body, history, context, surroundings, so they don't have that. So how would it be if they had that? How if they, were on a windy street and so it was changing their hearing? How would it be if they were a bit hungry? How would it be if they had not slept well the night before? And so if you go right out there and you emulate or represent in some way or feed in what would be a kind of ersatz experience, at least with the technology we have at the moment, maybe one day it won't become ersatz, it will become the real thing. But because if you think about it, our cognition is built on top of everything else, right? It didn't come first, it came last. And so it's couched in all the different layers of the neurophysiology and the sensation. And, single cell organisms can still move towards food and away from danger, towards heat and away from cold, whatever it is. So they don't have they've just got like the thin layer on the top. And if they could feel, because you think about it in a conversation, you go, oh God, what they said, that just made me feel slightly queasy. That in the political discourse of late October 2024, there's a lot that when I read the news can make me feel physically sick or uncomfortable, So anyway, it's just an interesting idea to think that the bit that they're missing is their own proprioception, not a better rendition of your perception.
Yeah. That said, actually, something that I've been wondering about, I bring this up on the show a lot. Cosmo Shalizi has this premise that institutions are like the ways that we outboard and compress information, like tacit knowledge, that we store it collectively. So it becomes a layer, like a social contract with your democracy or, your employer, the limited liability corporation.
Yeah.
And that AI is a beast of this particular type, that it's an information scaling meta individual that emerges out and becomes the calcium extrusion of the coral reef of our collective humanity. Many different people have talked about how it's like hard to actually regard it in any kind of rigorous way as an other, like I think that Nick Land's notion that or like Yuval Harari talk about, that this being kind of like an alien parasite, I think is just a complete paranoid bad trip misunderstanding of what's actually going on here. But like the point in that sense though, then is that maybe we're not actually improving anything by giving artificial intelligence proprioception because we are its proprioception.
Yeah.
I guess the way I'm thinking about it is more like, again, Kevin Kelly used to say, what's the point of reproducing human intelligence? Because we already do that. We already have that. We do it very well. It's very easy in some respect to make a person. What's unique and stimulating and new and surprising is this other thing.
Yeah, and I think just to pick up on that and finesse or perhaps contradict something I just said, it's kind of like what we tend to do automatically is want it to emulate us. And so the questions we tend to ask is how do we make it more like us, when maybe the question is how do we make it less like us so that it can do things we can't do and we can continue to do the things it can't do. So I suppose in what I was saying just then, it would be more intelligible and legible perhaps to us, would make more sense, would be more familiar were it to look and feel like us and have its own proprioception. And then it could say, I'm sorry, I had a bad night's sleep last night. But maybe that's exactly the least interesting thing to do. And the least interesting standards to hold it to are our own. So I agree with you. The kind of demonization of it to me seems to be imagining it's like us and bad, or I don't know. That just feels to me like not what's happening. And actually, I think the more daylight we could get between us and that, then the better it would be in terms of, yes, it needs to be like us to a certain extent for us to interact with it, but maybe we need to stop worrying about making it more like us. I was hearing a fascinating conversation you should talk to my friend Tom Chatfield. He's a philosopher of technology, and he was talking about AI this morning as time machines, something I'd not heard before. But you could basically train an AI on all the literature that the founding fathers of America would have conceivably been exposed to. And then you can ask it, what do you think they meant when they said X? And of course, you could do that with recent history. You could do it with subsets. And that to me was like, oh my God, I'd never thought of that. Not that I spend that much time thinking about it. But then you go, God, that's incredible. And that's absolutely not trying to make it just another intelligence like us. That's saying it could take us back in time and do a sort of emulation job for how those people thought based on the literature that they had access to, and that wouldn't provide an answer, but it would be a very interesting perspective and a very interesting historical research tool.
Yeah. So actually, I think we're closer to what I was hoping to explore, because you say on 89. It's so funny. I read this after going over to my friend Maxwell Lucas's house, where an entire wall of his home is whiteboards. I was so envious. I was envious of his wall.
I thought, yeah.
Yeah. You say the seed for this book was sown in an exploratory conversation captured on 4 huge whiteboards. If we'd only had a flip chart, I doubt I would have realized how rich the subject was. I started to get a little awkward and self-reflective about this, because I realized that in conversations, I tend to take notes on Post-its or like this tiny little clipboard. You say even different kinds of Post-its spawn different kinds of conversation. The giant flip chart sized ones enable the conversation to cover a lot of territory. Tiny ones force you to work with one thought at a time. I realized I might be playing small. And that this is when we get back to the issue of bandwidth, right?
Right.
I guess like what I'm thinking about is less the issue of getting the machine to experience the world like we do, or even at all.
Yeah.
But to look at what it means, honestly, like where this is going, which is a little weird, is into, like Neuralink. And well, computers can talk to each other orders of magnitude faster than we can talk to computers. Can we close that gap? Can we shrink that gap in a way that allows us to preserve ourselves? Because the one thing that, when we talk about the Congress of Ideas, the one thing that perhaps politely and intentionally does not come in this book is the notion of information exchange in the far more primordial biological sense of like sexual encounter. And that's what it seems like Silicon Valley is aiming for, is this complete ecstatic erosion of boundary between the self and the machine. But then where's the conversation once you lose the boundary?
You can't have a conversation with no boundary. You can't have complexity with no boundary. You need boundaries. It's about the kind of boundaries, and of what I studied at university, very little remains, but that which does is mostly about the synaptic gap and semi-permeable membranes and the concentration of sodium and potassium ions, and the idea that membranes, which are barriers, are necessary in order to have information exchange, in order to build kind of complexity, to send messages, all that kind of stuff. But the important thing being that they vary over time. So they're responsive to context. So depending upon the decay of the kind of axon potentials, those kinds of things, they'll fire or not. And the kind of accumulation of all of those is what affords a nervous system such a complex range of behaviors. So I think that, yeah, if you eroded all boundaries, you've got nothing. You've just got a kind of either back to the primordial soup or a kind of heat death. But if you've got rigid exclusive boundaries, or if you've got synaptic gaps, if you like, which are synaptic abysses across which no communication is possible, either because you've got the wrong ions in it, or the wrong solution, or the gap's too big, or the impulses are too slow, then that's problematic. So it's all about what kind of difference do you need in order to create the possibility of kind of synergistic action. But you need difference. In fact, there's a whole, if you think about potential difference, the more technical name for voltage, I just think it's such a fabulous phrase. If you go back to McGilchrist, there's a reason we've got 2 hemispheres that do 2 different things. The difference is important, and the kind of we have hens here at home. And so I see in them McGilchrist every day because they're like, I love it that they're pecking madly at a bit of food, and then they suddenly scare because they're switched from one system to the other. And then they're running along as if trying to save their lives. And then they suddenly go, oh, what's that? And so there's like flipping one to the other. And it's not very well integrated in a chicken, but you need both, potential difference is what affords, this is a solar off-grid house. So we've got a big battery array without the voltage that is represented by that difference. And the difference is what gives you the potential for, this computer to work, that light to shine. So then it's all about the kind of the nature of those boundaries, frontiers, and interfaces, and the permeability and the variability of the permeability. So again, just to bring it back to what we're doing now, when I have a rich, powerful, kind of mind-expanding, mind-bending conversation like this, I'll need to go and lie down in a darkened room afterwards. And that's me going into my refractory period. So if everything's full on the whole time, that's no good. So you've got the element of time and decay, and obviously that's a musical notion as well, as you well know. So, I think it's not about the erosion of all boundary. And, arguably, if you had that, you could argue that the process of complex organic life has been the creation of more and more sophisticated, refined kind of boundaries that are modulating the transmission of information. So these again, mycorrhizomes, what they're doing and how without them, a forest, through them, the trees can effectively talk to each other and talk with nutrients. So there's all these dialogic processes going on that involve things being transformed into other things that are constantly moving. And they can't always be all on the whole time, or it becomes stultifying, or it becomes locked. And I think that idea about the more information we could transmit, the faster, the more perfectly, the more cleanly in this sort of perfect union that just feels like such a mechanical notion to me. The other book, Pause, is about how there's a time to slow down and a time to accelerate. It's not that slow is good and fast is bad. It's about sensitivity and modulation and variation according to what's going on and what's needed. And so we're back to sensitivity and awareness. If you go back to the kind of Krishnamurti Gurdjieff point, the idea that most of the time we don't have that sensitivity. We're not paying attention. We're asleep. We're just going through these sort of automatic steps. And so then you've got awareness and consciousness popping up as the mediating device. That's where we have, it would appear anyway, the opportunity to make some choices about what information we get or where we put our attention.
So this is where I hoped we would get, right? Because two of the main pillars in this project are informed consent and the relationship between addiction and gaming, and how we have a reward system, we might as well use it. But if we optimize everything for reward, then we end up diabetic or, with track marks in our arm. And so you called me out a couple times in this book. You said, if you talk a lot, break that routine for a bit by staying quiet. I was like, oh, it's true.
I was thinking to myself,
I know, but that's so. And then in the thanks, because I knew to read the acknowledgments because you're just generally eloquent in your appreciation of people. You say, to the city and the University of Oxford, where conversation is in the ether, and in particular to the Taylorian Library, where conversation is forbidden, enabling me to spend so many quiet hours writing about it. So this is to your point about modulation. I want to get back to what you said, Tom Chatfield says about the language model as being able to snapshot a small corpus. This is what I've been playing with when Van Bettauer did Ask Future Fossils for me and trained a bot on just this show. Right. And then trained a chatbot on just Eric Davis's Expanding Mind and a chatbot on just Terence McKenna's lectures for the Psychedelic Salon. And then put those bots into conversation with each other. And you have corpora interacting with each other in a way that you really can't do yourself when you're engaged in a close read of the material. Like you can try and model these different philosophers and how they might have a conversation. But this whole genre of simulated AI podcast that's coming up now is really fascinating to me, not because, like you were saying about technology and conversation broadly, not because it replaces
the
podcast. Like the fact that you can dump scientific papers into Notebook LM, and you get what sounds like people talking to each other out of it. That's not a conversation. And the things that are the most annoying about it are where it affects that, where there's like the
Right.
two bots are agreeing with each other. And that's noxious. But it's interesting in that when you talk about silence and bandwidth and proximity, and I love the variability of permeability. The thing that I find most interesting and promising about retrieval augmented generative language models broadly is that now you can find a more abstract, distant way of interacting with the complete body of somebody's work. My friend Ken Adams used to tell me that I needed to come up with something back in the day. He'd say, you're prolific, I'm prolific. And speaking as someone who is prolific, let me tell you, like, I don't know where to start with your work. I don't know how to interact with it. You need to come up with some clever website that gives people more agency in how to navigate and where
Yeah.
to set foot into your material. Like there's that question about, coarse graining thing, or like you said, to interact with the entire constitutional Congress or the parliamentary debates. I like this notion of voltage. It's like everybody's trying to use technology to put lightning in a bottle, but without there being a charge, you don't get the lightning in the bottle. And so, the question of there's something about interacting with all of the works of, say, like Philip K. Dick. I've seen a couple people I know this week talk to Terence McKenna
Right.
online. My friend Jake Coburn and also Jason Silva both had social media reels of their interactions with this guy, which I consider a kind of unpleasant necromantic thing. It's a little on the nose because, Terrence predicted a lot of this stuff. And the question of those conversations getting fed back into the language models and creating a situation like mad cow disease where
Yeah.
the image of the actual historical person starts to blur out and get replaced gradually by the simulacrum of that
Yeah.
person is a serious concern. But
Yeah.
anyway, what am I saying? The issue of informed consent, you have to be able to say no. And so I feel like there's a foothold here where now we can place ourselves on a gradient of consent about the depth of engagement with some body of cultural material. Like before, you couldn't see it from orbit, and now you can.
Hmm.
And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. No, I think the idea of it's striking to me how I heard this notion just this morning, but the idea of how to make things more specific, to like take a corpus and look at what was available to the people drafting the Constitution of the United States. That in a way, perhaps the more interesting thing is not the superpower of everything it's able to do, but to be able to kind of limit it, get distance. As you're talking, I'm thinking, wow, I don't know about Terence McKenna. Would it be necromantic to want to hear a conversation between two chatbots trained on, I don't know, Einstein and Newton's work, or Kant and Spinoza, with the caveats that you point out about the danger? It's the kind of what I would dub the wedding video problem, right? Which is when the wedding becomes the video you took of it, not the actual wedding itself, and it ablates all other memory. But if we just leave that to one side for a moment, I study philosophy at university and I still struggle with some of the basic ideas and have to go back and look it up and read it again. And I can't help but feel that's because I don't have the kind of mind that can get to grips with all of that. And I somehow feel that if I could hear a conversation between, Spinoza and Leibniz, for example, even though I've read a book about the rivalry between those two, I think I'd get a lot more of a sense of it. And if I could engage in that as well and say, no, but hang on a minute, Spinoza, what Gottfried just said, so that feels interesting to me. But then I would need to go and lie down in a darkened room afterwards. I wouldn't want to move straight on to kind of Plato against Wittgenstein.
So actually, this is the thing that, in a sense, it feels like what we're doing here isn't new at all, right? Because we have engaged in narrative historical recreation, in historical drama
Yeah.
for ages.
Right.
And in that sense, it's not new. And in that sense, the problem is the wedding video problem, which I love. I'm
Yeah.
actually I have the wedding video that I took on the camera. I have not uploaded it to the computer from this summer. I haven't looked at it. I'm afraid to look at it
Yeah.
because I'm still like in that space of like, as soon as I do, then that's the vivid high bandwidth object instead of the feeling. But yeah, in a sense, the question of how to forget or how to make space, again, to go back to, Plato and writing, is that in a way we have a permanent record now. Books decay. They have their
Well,
own process, all of this storage media is ephemeral.
even so, even before you get to the storage problem, the decay problem, you have the kind of the partial problem. Dialogues, in a way, what Plato was pointing out was that dialogues have, again, a temporal feature to them. There's an energy to the rate and rhythm of question and response, call and response, to use the jazz vernacular. And when you anchor that, as well as making it partial, because you're in your very choice of words and even in your choice of the language you write it, so Plato's Phaedrus written in Latin or Greek or English or French or Spanish or Chinese would be importantly different. But so, there's all manner of questions before you even get to the decay problem about the partiality of it. And actually, that arguably what he was also suggesting was that the kind of the energy and the feeling of the nature of the response, the thing it sparks off in the living organism that's engaged in the dialogue, is to be back at the wedding. And all the writing is to just watch the video. Now, of course, were it not for the writing, we wouldn't have the Plato. So, it's not as simple as that. But I think you're right to say that, in a way, there is nothing new here. And yet it's similar problems and issues and challenges are being rendered in very different ways that probably introduce significant elements of novelty, but also sometimes make it hard to see that it is the same thing we've been grappling with. So there's two things going on.
So this is where I want to land it, because you're talking about Zoom calls, and you mentioned, Priya Parker in The Art of Gathering suggests you can't really have a conversation with more than 30. I am more drastic in my experience. Once you get into double figures, things start to change. Everyday miracles can't be scaled. And then how, breakout groups and Zoom calls, which I've noticed becoming more of a prominent phenomenon. It doesn't solve this problem, it recreates it. Breakout groups give people more chance to speak, but only by fragmenting the conversation into separate shards, which are hard to put together again. This is why the reporting back on small groups is so often dreadful. And I feel like this is what you're talking about here is the same kind of thing. It's like, in a way, there's a symmetry or a parity between scientific efforts to unify relativity and time symmetrical equations in physics, and then thermodynamics, where there's an arrow. And then this other issue of recording things in information media, and then how do we keep the space for novelty? So it's like, to take it back to music, as a looping musician, this is how I think about a lot of this stuff in embodied practice, that, once you're like 20 layers deep, you can't really play on top of that. And in closing, I would love for you to reflect on where you see agency in particular fitting into all of this.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about where I ended up through the process of writing that book, it is interesting, as you point out, that I lay so much store by the bodily and the somatic. And this last piece, where we've been talking about refractory periods and temporality and the need for modulation and variation, makes me wonder whether that really what I'm fumbling towards is this idea of, like, you had to be there, and agency can only come from your being there. And my point that Priya Parker is kind of optimistic, I think, is because what I describe is conversation as an intimate form. And by intimacy, I don't mean about the sharing of secrets or sensitive information. I describe it as the ability to be in touch with. And so whatever the machine's capacities to be in touch with us are, for us to be fruitfully exercise our agency, be awake, pay attention, make choices about how we're participating, we have to be able to sense the others that we are in this case, conversation with. And as soon as we lose that sense of being in touch with them, it becomes something else. It doesn't become nothing, but it becomes something else. And the richest, the most powerful conversation is about being able to be in touch altogether. And that's what I call a conversational field. And there's a sublime sense of that when one's, to get, again, take it back to the kind of Krishnamurti thing, that one's sense of self in the ego sense erodes. And you feel that you're participating in a kind of co-created field. And it's funny, I feel I have most agency when I most disappear, almost. That's how it feels, because that's when my kind of, I don't know, my egoistic self is eroded. And now I'm just participating in an emergent, unfolding, exciting, delightful process. And I think that's the opportunity that a good conversation affords us, which was interesting and pleasurable and important enough to me to feel it was a theme worth exploring. And, what we do with that, I don't know. But that sense of a good conversation isn't just this exchange of information. It can't just be at this thin level. So then the question becomes, how can machines support that? And we've had several instances in this conversation. So for me, the idea of eavesdropping and maybe participating in a conversation between two bots trained on a set of historical information, I'm like, oh, can I do that? Is that available now? That feels like that could help me be in touch with that body of ideas from those, in this case, historic thinkers. But the idea that we don't get to exercise that and what we're doing can be just reduced to what you described as the kind of erosion of all the boundaries and this massive, simultaneously hyper connection of information. It feels to me still like it's importantly missing something, which is the, physical embodied. So I don't know if that goes anyway to what you were asking about, but that's what I'm feeling now.
I guess when I think about trying to coordinate the question of how many people can an intimate conversation actually sustain in space, and then the question of how much does the presence of the past and the future constrain what's going on now, they feel like the same question at 90 degrees. Like when you say that the greatest agency that you feel is when you enter a kind of flow state. If I'm looking at you on a brain scan, if there is the augmented reality interface where I can see how awake you are
Right.
moment to moment, right? You're like, I can see, oh, I'm talking to
Lights up.
the complete Rob Poynton. That is where you are processing enough information, to put it in that language, that you're not trying to derive, extract, and consolidate a story.
Right.
You're not trying to bind yourself in time and in space. And
yeah,
so that just seems like it's, to bring it back to where we started about generative art and hallucination and generative conversation. It seems like, in a weird way, that the attempt to use technology as leverage in the world actually inhibits or interferes with entering the state of consciousness in which, by your definition, agency emerges.
that feels right. Yeah. And it's interesting because you said at the beginning, you contrasted the instrumental with intrinsic in talking about, conversations to get somewhere known or conversation for the kind of joy of it. And my observation, building on what you'd drawn out of the book, was this idea that you actually get somewhere by not trying to get there, and we're revisiting that now. And so it just strikes me, I wonder what would happen if you got a machine intelligence if you just concentrated on, this doesn't make any sense, but it's like, what would happen if you asked it to just like enjoy itself? Like and I suppose, I don't know how these things work, but I guess you'd have to have it attempt at least to enable the people with whom it was interacting to enjoy themselves. And one way you might do that is to say, use really beautiful language. So go off and find beautiful language. I have copywriter friends actually one was telling me the other day, he said that ChatGPT has become very useful to them because they now can hear in their mind's ear how ChatGPT says things. So when they're writing their own copy, and they can hear when they start to conform to their image of ChatGPT's tone of voice, they go, "Don't do that," So, so it clearly has a sort of, that instrument anyway has a tone. So I wonder what would happen if you just said, love the language, enjoy the language, use language you think other people will enjoy, and fuck the rest. Would it actually turn out to be more useful? Because you've given it a kind of joy and delight. And again, I'm very aware of this language is all kind of projecting some kind of experience onto the machine, but leave that to one side for the moment. I'm not supposing that is the case, but as if, would I then go to a chatbot because I just like to hear its voice?
So I love this point, because there is this issue of, if you don't specify in the prompt that you want a unique voice, then you get the center of the Gaussian distribution
Right.
of everything humans have written online, which is why people find it so revolting, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's just the lowest common denominator of humanity.
Even before we had AI, I used to have that objection because, writing professionally in business, I always thought that business and organizational writing was proto-academic, and most academic writing is proto-scientific. None of it really hits the bar. Great scientists like Ravelli or Einstein actually write poetically. Like, what the fuck is going on, people? Like, so it always felt to me that most human writing isn't literature. Most of it's pretty dross. So if you then train very powerful computers on that, of course you're going to get this kind of, and how about if we had more Auden and Eliot and Castaneda and stuff like that?
That actually brings me to another place where I felt like you were reminding me of my own growth edge. On page 65, under the section "Be Generous," where you make the point that the core practice of improvisation is that everything is an offer, that anything can be taken and used. You say, think about the offers you make. Are you making simple, clear, explicit offers? Check. You are doing and saying things that give other people something to work with. And I was thinking, of course, about these like Byzantine 20-minute questions that I ask people on this show, and how you either love it or you hate it, right? You either think it's like watching a flock of birds in flight, or you're like, what the fuck are you asking the guest? Shut up. But my point has always been to prompt the guest to say something that they're not going to say to the Associated Press, right? And like, this is exactly what you're talking about. It's like, yes, okay, I could get more succinct, but how would this change if we were generous in the ways that we prompt the chatbot in that specific way, where it's like, give the bot something to work with. Don't be boring.
And that goes back to your earlier question about, what would the ideas I'm exploring in this book mean if we apply it to this more technological kind of realm of conversation. And I think it's interesting. I work with Richard Olivier at Oxford, and so Richard Olivier is the son of Sir Laurence Olivier, and he has this phrase I really love, where he talks about acting as if. So acting as if. It doesn't matter whether you believe, that this idea or this character or this piece of language, act as if it were true or it could be useful, And so in this case, why not act as if the bot needed something interesting to work with, as if it were a person with a limited attention span and a set of concerns and kids that needed to be got to school, and you might get something back. So that's a prior step to what I was talking about, which is about how could these things be programmed so that, perhaps they produced enjoyment or gleaned enjoyment for themselves. Act as if it has that and offer it something different, And I think just to pick up on that, on the specific point about your style of, it's not so much questioning. It's like what you're doing is you're offering a million start points. And so actually that is generous. It's just different. And what you've done is what you're always doing is offering a kind of plurality of things. And I feel often a bit uncertain and discombobulated by the range and scope and wealth of them. But that's because I'm bringing to a kind of, if I bring to a kind of media interview frame of the conventional kind, then that's absolutely not going to work. But what it's constantly inviting me to do is to find the thing I haven't thought of before, I haven't said before. And that's why I keep coming back to conversations with you, is because it's rich and it's learning, it's plural, it's expansive. And so I would argue that it, sparing your blushes, it's generous in a different way than perhaps people might understand. But you're not expecting me to talk to all those points. So as soon as something captures, what I'm paying attention to is my energy, my interest. I'm looking at, what is your riff? Where does it make me want to riff? And you're liberating me as well from having to worry about whether it makes any immediate sense, which is liberating, and that's how you get generative, right? Is because we stop worrying about whether it makes sense or whether we sound intelligent or whether we sound like we've actually thought about this at all. And you go, that leads to this, leads to that. And this will sit with me and these ideas will simmer. And most of it probably will just, dissipate, and that's fine.
Except in the quantum computer diamond that will forever trap me in the mistakes of my past. Anyway, I don't know where we're going to trim this, but
you'll find somewhere.
Yeah, I'm always grateful to talk to you. Thanks again for listening. This show was launched with seed grants from O'Shaughnessy Ventures, Cosmos Institute, Imaginal Seeds, and BitTensor, and is always looking to plant more seeds. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and comment at YouTube, Apple, or Spotify, or wherever your algorithmic overlords will recommend it to cool strangers. And of course, consider becoming a patron. And if you'd like me in the mix as a general purpose poet, scholar, weirdo, strategist / catalyst, reach out to humansontheloop@proton.me to swipe one of the last remaining spaces on my dance card. Next week, we're going deep into the mind and work of Michael Dean, a masterful writer and buddy from the OSV 2024 cohort who is mapping the architecture of great essays and building an AI editor that frees your creativity from worries about product market fit. Until then, take care and remember, attention is our greatest natural resource. But then again, my original slogan was imagination is our greatest natural resource. I like them both. Use whichever helps you more.